Welcome to the 4Fs with Jeff.
Welcome back to the 4Fs podcast. Today's guest is Microsoft legend, Mr. Rich Kaplan. The thing about Rich that makes him a legend isn't only his public accomplishments, like selling over 20,000 copies of Windows 95 on QVC and leading efforts for Y2K compliance at Microsoft. I'm also talking about his reputation as a legendary leader. And in this episode, we'll talk about that, about leading through chaos and the art of influence without authority. You'll hear how Rich navigated high-stakes meetings with Steve Ballmer, why clarity beats charisma in leadership, and how a near-death experience reshaped his priorities around faith, health, family, and service. This episode covers bunkers in the desert, has an unexpected cameo by the Blue Angels Jets, and more wisdom than a week's worth of TED Talks. This is one of the cases where the conversation definitely exceeded my expectations. And as always, just remember, when you got no more F's to give, we got you covered. Let's get into it. I might have mentioned it in one of the emails we traded, but the thing that stands out to me the most as I was preparing here and speaking with different people was your reputation. Like, there are a lot of leaders at Microsoft who've done amazing things, and some of them have accomplished things and people still like them, and some of them have just accomplished things and full stop. And so you have a laundry list of accomplishments, but the number one thing was always, well, just genuinely and generally liked you as a person. And so I think that's really cool. I'm assuming that didn't just happen. It doesn't happen happenstance, you know? So you probably had an intentional approach. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about what and kind of how you approach leadership in general. Yeah.
You know, I would say this: leaders can articulate a vision. Leaders articulate a mission. Leaders can take those things and operationalize them. It should be the core of everything that leaders do. What you don't need leaders to do, and a lot of them do at Microsoft, is you don't need them to be experts or the individual contributor, the best individual contributor. What you need them to be are the people who clarify things, who help when there's a block and break that block. Leaders have to pick their people, you know, and I find you need all kinds of people to partner with you when you're leading. So, you know, you might say, well, we need a bunch of devs to work on a piece of software we're doing. Okay, that's great. But break those devs down. And what you'll find is you have some people who are introverts who might have the best ideas, but they feel uncomfortable expressing them. You have people with attention deficit disorder who have really, really, really great ideas. They're brilliant, but you really have to listen to hear them, right? You have deep experts who move projects forward. And the leader has to be responsible for that mission and to help people move forward on that mission. And when they're off mission, say, hey guys, you know what? This is not the outcome that we're trying to drive. I'd say there's tons of meetings I've been in where you walk away from the meeting and you go, what did we achieve? Right? And so leaders provide clarity. And so that is what I've always done. And I appreciate every single kind of person, recognizing you have all different kinds of people. And you can't say, well, you know, you all have to be the smartest person in the room. Right. So knowing that to me is what's important.
So you mentioned a bunch of different people, described a bunch of different people in a very good way. You know, you talked about the different neurotypical people that we work with and, you know, neurodivergent. And then you talked about how they receive messaging in different ways. Did you craft, when you think about preparing a message and creating a vision that you need to be able to articulate to people, were you intentional about, you know, kind of making different flavors based on your audience? Or did you more look for one message that could be consumed by a wide variety of people?
It's a fabulous question. I think you have to have one message that's consumed by a lot of people, but I will tell you this. I once did a presentation articulating a vision for the group that I was working in that clarified how all the different teams work together against a common objective. And I heard someone say after the meeting, they didn't know I was there, that's the best presentation I've ever heard. And then I heard someone else say, just 15 seconds later, say, again, they thought they were out of earshot of me, say, he didn't say anything. And so you have to recognize that some people will get your message when you deliver it, And some people won't. And then you have to reinforce it in every single meeting. And in fact, one of the things I do in meetings, I hadn't thought about it till you asked. I often say at the beginning of the meeting is, this is what our objectives are. This is what our objectives are. And the reason I say that is because in the meeting, often what happens is people go, well, what about this? And that gives me the opportunity to come back and go, yeah, you know what? As I articulated at the beginning of the meeting, that might be important. That is not our mission or goal. And we're not going to focus on that today.
That's a wise thing, I think, to set expectations at the beginning there. And I like that you called that out. So something else we talked about a little bit during trading emails was around how something that was raised was your ability to lead effective meetings. And that's something you mentioned just now is a key thing for you was to set objectives at the beginning to avoid the proverbial topic creep or scope creep for those meetings, right? We can always define what we're trying to do and circle back to that. So do you have any other kind of key things that you would always keep in mind as you were running meetings? Like some people are big fans of the read ahead memo, right? The pre-read. Some folks are not fans of the pre-read. Just curious if you have any of those.
Well, let me start this way. There's a lot of really smart people at Microsoft, right? Very, very smart. And often in meetings, they like to show you how smart they are.
Yeah.
And sometimes, I know you've heard this, they like to show that they are the smartest person in the room rather than solving the customer problems. I'd say, and this is not a direct answer to your question, but I'll get to it. I've taken my share of intellectual thrashings in meetings from senior people who thought showing that they were super smart would drive the strategy or agenda. It does not, right? So, in short answer is I view meetings completely different. The goal of any meeting that I went to where I was presenting up, we'll talk about people presenting to me. When I was presenting up to the leadership is to get guidance from the senior leaders, right? Anyone who comes and presents, let me say this also, anyone who comes and presents to a senior leader is anxious just from positional authority, right? They spend a lot of time prepping. If the meeting's on a Monday morning, which you should never do, by the way, or on a Friday afternoon, people spent time on the weekend, for example, prepping to be in that meeting. That's just bad leadership because people are going to be anxious. They're going to be anxious across the weekend. And why set people up for that? Okay. So when I say that when I come to a meeting, I come to get guidance. I had one meeting where I was presenting and everyone I was presenting to was yelling. They were not agreeing with our strategy. They were telling me, no, we can't do that. And I kept saying and smiling, I appreciate the feedback. I kept presenting, even though they were trying to go off strategy, as I had mentioned before. I kept presenting. I smiled. And in the end, I said, hey, I really appreciate the feedback. And then, the call was over. And after that meeting, one of the CVPs called me and I thought, oh no. And she said to me, she goes, how do you do that? I said, what? She goes, they were all complaining and yelling and telling you what you couldn't do. They were not helping. They were not giving guidance. She goes, and you kept acknowledging their feedback and smiling and kept on agenda. She goes, how'd you do that? And I hadn't really thought about it because this is what I always do, and it's to get to the root of the question you're asking. I said, well, I was going there for feedback. I don't take anyone's feedback personally. I wasn't asking if I wasn't going there for approval. I never go to meetings for approval. I go to meetings for guidance. I got that guidance. Some of it I liked, some of it I'll completely ignore because I don't agree with their guidance. And so I'm going to do what I was going to do to begin with. They were informed and they provided me some guidance. So I share that with other people so that they recognize, that's how you should think about any meeting with anyone is that you're getting guidance. You're not going there for approval. Once in a while, if it's something like headcount, guess what? You're going there for approval. Yeah. If it's budget, you're going there for approval. But other than everything else, you're going for guidance. And I've had meetings with Steve before where he suggested that, for example, the name of a marketing plan that we were going to use externally, he didn't agree with it, didn't like it. The team spent a ton of time on it. And after the meeting, they go, what do you think? I said they didn't like it, that Steve didn't like it. And in the end, guess what? We used it anyway because the team felt like they had done the research and I was responsible then to tell Steve, hey, I appreciate the feedback. Here's what we did. So maybe that's, I don't think about how I do this, but those are the things that I do.
That's a really great anecdote and a story and to illustrate what we're talking about. So that kind of ability to first ask for feedback and advice and then hear it and then sort through it and kind of pick what resonates with you and what doesn't. I'm curious if you think that one, if you see this, in other parts of your life, right? I mean, I'm assuming that you've had times in your life when you've reached out to mentors or other people you want for advice and then take that and feel it. And that's something I'd just be really interested to hear is how you go about kind of sorting that out. If it's intentionally, you just kind of, it's more of a trust your gut kind of thing. And then also how you hone that skill in your career to be able to sort through a lot of advice. Because I find when I get advice, and I don't know how others would feel about this, but just because someone you respect gives you advice, and it might be great advice, it just might not be right for you. So being able to sift through that and understand it both in a career situation and in a personal situation, I think that's a skill.
Here, let me take this direction. I
Yeah.
didn't really think about talking about it. In 2005, which is now 20 years ago, in 2005,
That's wrong. That just feels wrong. I'm
it
sorry to
does
say
feel
that.
wrong. In 2005, I was the corporate vice president of Windows security marketing. That role exists today. And we had a team event at a restaurant, which is downtown Seattle or Capitol Hill. And I got food poisoning. And that food poisoning led to a hospital visit. And it led to, I was in extreme pain and I was having blood clots. Seems weird from food poisoning, but it turns out, and I knew this, I have a blood clotting disorder. And that situation, I was in the ICU for 5 days. I almost died. And weirdly, I ended up having chemotherapy. The reason I had chemotherapy was the doctor came in and she said, we're going to start chemotherapy. I said, do I have a choice? She goes, no. I go, well, I'm an analytical guy. I said, is there research? She goes, yeah. I said, show me the research. She goes, well, there's been research, but there are no clinical studies. And I'm like, okay. And so I started chemo that day, and I'm alive because this is University of Washington, Fred Hutch, because a doctor made a call and did something experimental. When someone's going to die immediately, you don't need clinical trials. You can do anything to save someone's life. And so she gave me chemotherapy to reset my immune system. And I had to have chemotherapy basically every week for about 5 weeks. And one of the things that I learned during that time is I sort of remember sitting there with that line attached to your arm getting chemo. And I remember thinking, how did I get here? I'm working my butt off. I'm working on hard problems like Windows security strategy, servicing strategy. I'd worked on Y2K, which we're going to talk about. I'm like, how did I end up here? And I started thinking about what are my priorities. And I realized, for me, my priorities when you think you're going to die, my priorities are the following. My faith, and I'm not saying be religious or go to church or temple. I'm not saying that. Just believing that there's something more than this helps you to continue on. Belief, my faith. And then the next thing is my health, because if you don't have your health, you at least have your faith. But if you don't have your health, you can't do anything else. That's my second priority. And then my third priority was my family, because if you have your faith and your health, you can help your family and prioritize your family. You should always do that. And then fourth, helping others, right? And that should be my aspiration in life. The reason I tell you that is because it provides me clarity about what's important in meetings, right? When I said before a bunch of people were yelling, was it impacting my health? No. My family? No. Was it impacting me helping others? No. I was going to help others. I was going to use their guidance and help others. So it's not on the list anywhere. And so it provides me the ability often to be calm, even when everyone else in the room is not. And then I'd probably add one last thing that's maybe is unrelated. I always focus on what is the customer outcome we're trying to drive in this meeting. Sometimes it's not a customer meeting, but I often look all the way, up the tree and say, are we working on a customer outcome here? Is this just something internal? And there is often something customer focused. And so then I use those things to help provide that level of clarity to myself and to help others.
That was a great answer. Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to really give a personal perspective there. I may be oversimplifying this, but when you were talking at the end there, I was thinking about in both scenarios, you're thinking about outcomes effectively, right? You're thinking about when you're meeting, you're comparing, is this outcome related to the meeting? And when you're in a situation, you're thinking about what outcomes am I looking for in my life effectively? And how are these
Right.
things important to what I want out of my life? I appreciate you taking that time. And this answers a question that I had, which was around your connection to Fred Hutch. And this makes, I'm assuming that's where that began.
Yeah, yeah. So that began there. My wife and I, and I'm not. We'll just go this direction for
Sure.
now
Yeah.
for a while. So my wife and I, for many years, were on the fundraising board of the Hutch. Basically, the Hutch saved my life, so we kind of felt like we were responsible to give back to them. I ended up being sort of an ambassador between the Hutch and Microsoft. Each year, at a high level, I won't give specific numbers. Each year, employees and Microsoft gives to Fred Hutch Cancer Research. Some of it is in kind for products like Azure, and some of it is in real dollars. Why? Well, you know how how they're solving cancer right now, using big data, studying human genomes stored in the cloud, using AI to match find matches and patterns in those genomes. That's everything that Microsoft does. And so you look at the work that they're doing and you look at the work that Microsoft is investing in, and you got to realize that there's an opportunity there. So, like I said, Microsoft employees spend millions of dollars every year for the Hush, and I work to just make sure that happens. So, that being on this board, and while I was on that board, I complained a lot about things. One of the things that Chris mentioned in his podcast that people could be open and truthful and give feedback. Well, I give a lot of feedback, good and bad, mostly bad. And so I gave enough feedback that over time, the CEO decided that my wife, Carmen, and I should be the chairman of the board of the philanthropy board, that we should run the philanthropy board. And so you have to be careful what you complain about. So we ran that board for a number of years. And then eventually they got rid of that board. And now they just have a board of advisors. And my wife sits on that board, helping to drive the strategy forward for the Hutch. So I'm deeply grateful and I'm incredibly hopeful about the work that they're doing.
That's awesome. You mentioned your wife, and speaking of, I got an unrequested LinkedIn message yesterday from her saying,
From your wife?
from your wife, saying, hey, maybe ask other questions to Rich Kaplan about more than Y2K. And so I responded, I said, yes, absolutely. Anything you want me to ask, just tell me. And I didn't, so I thought I'd ask you though, anything that you think that she would want you to, would want to, since it's topical right now. I caught the feeling like maybe there's something funny here that she wants to, or a good story that she wants to tell us about. But anyway, I didn't get that far.
There's lots of funny things. During the Windows 95 days, I got a lot of screen time. There was a TV show in the morning called 7 Live. Joyce Taylor, who's a current news anchor in Seattle, I was on with her demoing Windows 95. And you can find that somewhere, or I can send you a clip of it. And I asked her things like, how many applications do you run at once? And she was like, because back then, even if not everyone used a PC and most people only did one thing at a time. And I was talking about preemptive multitasking in Windows 95.
I watched the one of the Windows 95 videos, and that blew me away that one of the data points was only 30% of people were using more than one app at a time. And I was like, I looked down at my desktop and countless apps open.
Yeah, I
It's
have
just
multiple apps open right now. Yeah.
it's just a jumble.
No. Anyway, and I talked about plug and play. Back then, CD-ROMs were a big thing, and in the past, if you got a CD-ROM drive, you got a floppy with so Windows 95 had this thing called Articulate like so, plug and play, where you can just plug in a CD-ROM drive and it works, right? And so that was fun. Then someone saw that at Corp, and QVC, right, the quality value channel, said, hey, can someone come here and present on Windows 95? And so they picked me to fly back and present on QVC for a couple hours of the features of Windows 95, right? And my wife happened to be at a neighborhood party, and they're like going, well, where's Rich? And she goes, well, he had to do something. He can't be here for the party. And they were going through the TV, and they're like, there he is. There's Rich, right? Demoing Windows 95. I got to meet Neil Armstrong. He was on there presenting a
Cool.
book that he'd done that was super fun. And I also got to meet Susan Lucci.
Oh,
Anyway, I sold 22,000 copies of Windows 95 without a EA, one at a time, on QVC. She'd probably tell you that.
it's awesome. I love that story. Puts a lot in perspective about just different times in selling software and being so effective at it. I was reading back through one of the old PR releases for a next release of Windows and then right around Y2K. And there was this relating to another one of your on-screen appearances. It talked about to be able to check out and get information to make sure your PC was compliant and all of that. And then for people who didn't have the internet, the solution was to partner with Blockbuster Video to go and pick up your DVD. And I just thought it reminded me of what a different time that was and where we are now. The problems that you were trying to solve. I mean, solving problems is selling more software, go on QVC,
Yeah.
solve problems of distribution, work with Blockbuster. And I don't know that either one of those would be extremely effective today, but they
Right.
worked. They did the trick.
Right. So a lot of people, thanks for calling it out because I'd forgotten. People didn't really understand what Y2K is, right? There's a lot of talk about it. And frankly, it generated a ton of fear because it was a technology issue. And some people were saying, hey, you know what? This is the end of the world. There's going to be, right? People were crazy. We laughed a lot about bunkers, right? And people having generators. I'll tell you this. One of the things we talked about, and then I'll tell you about that video, but one of the things we talked about is what if there's actually a power outage because the power utilities running our software and we lose power and then we don't have power in the building where we generate the software. So for Y2K, we leased generators for Building 26 on campus, which is where Windows was, so that if the power went out, we could generate fixes for the power company and everyone else. But sorry, I went sort of sideways. Let me get back to this thing about Blockbuster and distributing DVDs. So how long have you lived in Seattle?
I don't live in Seattle anymore, but I was there from I was there for about 5 years. I moved out away in 2019. Not
Okay,
5 years, 4
so
years. Yeah.
my wife's basically lived in Seattle her whole life, and I moved here in 1982. And in 1984, there was a TV show that came out in Seattle called Almost Live. It was a local comedy. In some senses, it was like Saturday Night Live, but it was local. Okay. And there was a guy on there named Bill Nye. And he was an engineer at Boeing, but he was also a comedy writer. And he was a behind the scenes guy. People didn't know him. But one day, and he knew the host of the show was a guy by the name of John Keister. And one day, since it was live, right, they were doing it live comedy, one of the guests didn't show. And so they asked Bill Nye if he could do something for 6 minutes to fill a segment. Okay. And one of the guys said, well, Bill, you're the guy who does all that science stuff. You love science. They said, go do some science stuff. And as I recall, what he did is he took an onion, immediately froze it, and then he hit it with a hammer, and the onion went everywhere. And so basically, the guy said, well, wow, you're Bill Nye the science guy. Okay. And so that was the start of his career of this Boeing employee who was a writer who suddenly was out in front of all these people. Okay. And so he was locally known. Okay. So that's 1984. So 15 years later, he's still not really nationally known, right?
Yeah.
But the team and I realized, you know what? You need someone people are not afraid of, who will make it a funny thing, easy to understand so that kids understand it. And so that's how we basically came up with the idea to partner with him and partner with Blockbuster to say, hey, anywhere in the world, if you're worried about this, we just have this DVD you could watch. And essentially, will help you understand what this is. So this is a Telly Award for Microsoft Studios for Is Your Computer Ready for
That's
Y2K?
awesome.
And it's a public service award. It's a public service award for things like that. And we won that basically because of that work. We got tons of positive feedback, and it's sort of a model for the future for that period of time is how do you take a tough technical problem and make it easier for people to understand?
It was done exceptionally well. I went back and watched it, and I love the history about Bill Nye. I mean, I grew up knowing Bill Nye and all of that, and most now he's, I think, better known as his as a little bit of a political spokesman. But
Yeah.
as for our age, he was always Bill Nye the Science Guy. I love how he got his nickname there. So you mentioned the power outage, and that's something that I was curious about. Like Joe Consumer, I wasn't at Microsoft at the time. And so Joe Consumer, I was kind of with the public thinking, oh gosh, there's this real thing, like the power might go out and all of that. And so I was curious like inside Microsoft, it sounds like there was also the fear, okay, this really could happen. Like there could really be a thing. What was kind of the general consensus within the walls of Microsoft of about the severity of Y2K. And then second of all, I guess this is maybe a good transition to talk about where you were at the time and then how you pivoted and kind of got involved in that whole thing.
I tell you what, let's start there, and then I'll come back and answer that question.
Yeah, sounds good.
And if I don't, come at me again, so that I could do that.
Yes, sir.
In 1997, I was the general manager of sales, consulting, and something called Advanced Technology Consulting in the Pacific Northwest. So I was at Microsoft, and my group was responsible for a territory: Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Alaska. And then I had a consulting group that worked on special projects globally where people needed advanced consultation on breakthrough things that they were working on. As a part of that job, I talked to a lot of customers. And again, 1997. And customers in the Northwest, these are probably commonly known, or maybe not. Big customers in the Northwest: Starbucks, headquartered here; Boeing, headquartered here; Nordstrom, headquartered here; Weyerhaeuser, headquartered here; PACCAR, who makes long distance truck, headquartered here; the Naval Undersea Warfare Center, headquartered here. And so I talked to a lot of big customers. And how I ended up getting the Y2K job is we were having a staff meeting, my whole team, and Steve Ballmer, who was the executive vice president of sales, at the time my boss's boss, came and presented. We were talking about, I don't recall what we're talking about exactly. Probably not relevant. But at the end of that presentation, we did a Q&A. And so people had lots of questions of Steve, obviously a brilliant man. And I raised my hand and I asked one, and I said, Steve, I said, Northwest customers, some of the ones I just mentioned to you, Northwest customers are anxious and worried about Y2K. I said, who owns that? And he goes, well, you sent me a mail. And I had like 3 weeks before that he didn't answer. I go, who owns it? I said, someone needs to own it. And I said it kind of in the voice maybe you just heard. I said, someone needs to own this. And he looked at me and he said, well, then you do. And I'm thinking, I said, I don't. I'm the GM of sales. And he looks at me and he goes, not anymore. And so that's how I ended up getting Y2K. It was a tough customer problem. He recognized it, and it needed someone to coordinate broadly across the company, set the strategy, decide on what we would service and what we would not, talk to governments, right? Have a set of policies, talk to the press. And, essentially that's how I got that job. So I'll pause for a second.
I have so many questions, but so you inadvertently stepped in something that you weren't necessarily intending in stepping in, but then you were voluntold that this was going to happen. And so it happened. But I'm curious, these meetings with Steve. So I've never been, privy to be in one, but I hear the closest thing is, seen at the old MGX days or, anything else where he seems to, have high energy and very strong voices, strong opinions. I'm trying to imagine what this conversation is like. Is this how it goes to where he's just like really emphatic and telling you and there's no questioning about it? Or how does this conversation with Steve like more legit?
Yeah, there was no question about it. Right. This wasn't a private conversation. It was in front of my whole staff.
Oh, wow.
There was 50 people in the room.
Yeah.
Right.
Good point.
Right. And so he knew it needed to be addressed. He knew I was the loudest voice. Maybe not. I mean, I might have complained louder than other people. Certainly customers were complaining. Or maybe it was a spur of the moment. I was condescending regarding that he should be accountable for it. And his response was, if you're going to bitch about it, you sign up for it.
Yeah.
Right. And frankly, good learning for anyone's career. Be prepared. It's fine to give feedback. It's fine to complain. It's fine to want to drive accountability, but be prepared that you're going to be the one who gets it.
That's a good point. Clearly you were, as prepared as you could have been. You were prepared enough to be able to successfully accomplish this task. I have one other logistical question before you move further down there. You were talking about leading a team of consultants. Was this pre-MCS days when you had I think you mentioned you had a team that were helping solve those problems? Were you helping to solve them from a sales perspective through partners then? Or was this?
No, this was MCS. For those listening, that's Microsoft Consulting Services. In the old days, Microsoft Consulting Services reported to the GMs of sales. In today's environment, the consulting organization is a completely separate organization that teams up with support and others to drive consulting. But in these days, sales and consulting were tied tightly together. And like I said, I had another group, advanced technology consulting. That was one that helped global people really drive breakthroughs with our products that happened to be under me. It could have sat under anybody, but it was close to campus. And those days that was managed by a guy by the name of Walid Abu Hadba. And he was just great running that team.
So you get the job, you're voluntold that this is going to happen, and then you move forward. How did you go about approaching this from there?
Chris had broken down in his session that you did with him that there was 6 focus areas. There was a bunch of things you have to recognize just based on customer complaints, which was, first, what products are we fixing? Let me pick extremes. We had some kids products, CD-ROMs products. We had an encyclopedia product, right?
Encarta. I remember
it was
this,
called Encarta. If Encarta had a Y2K bug in it, what is the downside to that? Well, none, nothing, not really. But we also had Windows NT Server. What is the downside if that goes down? It's very different. So we had to come up with a set of consumer and enterprise policies. We had to decide when something is supported and when it's not. And what we had come up with, and this was not just a Y2K thing, was, okay, for all products, we're going to support them 5 years after we release them. After 5 years, we're not accountable to support them. And that was our policy for consumer products. And then for enterprise products, it was similar. 5 years of what we called mainstream support, and then 5 years of what we called extended support. In mainstream support, we'd add features. We'd say, hey, you know what, this product we launched and we missed this, so we're going to add the following features. Examples of that were for Windows service packs. Windows, for example, XP had Service Pack 1, Service Pack 2, and Service Pack 3. Service Pack 2, which my team was responsible for launching, had a bunch of security features in it because Windows needed to be more secure. And so we built a ton of features into Service Pack 2. So you have this thing called mainstream support where you add features, and then extended support is when you've decided it's out of mainstream support. And what we're going to do is we're going to provide bug fixes as necessary, and we're going to provide security updates. And you do that for 5 more years. So now you have 10 years of support of a product. Well, what about customers who are using something for more than 10 years? So we came up with something called custom support. And Chris mentioned this. Custom support is for specific enterprise customers who want to pay for support, even though it's out of support, but they have it embedded in something. They can't change it for some reason. It's in something that's deployed into a remote area, so they just need to continue to get support. That's called custom support. Custom support is very expensive. Part of the reason it's expensive is to motivate you to get off that software and get on the new software. Okay. So we had to clarify that for everybody. Most people don't think about it. You have to clarify that for everybody of what we're going to support under Y2K. Okay. So some interesting things fell out of that. For example, Windows 95, which is a consumer product, had been out 5 years. So do you fix Y2K bugs in Windows 95 as a consumer product? So again, Chris was talking about the technology. I was responsible for the company policy. And so I talked to a lot of people. And in the end, we decided that we were not going to fix Y2K issues for Windows 95. It's a consumer product. There's no risk because it's a consumer product. And enterprise customers should be on Windows 2000, shouldn't be on Windows 95. So I'm going to give you a background story associated with that. So after I made that decision, I had an enterprise customer, I won't name them, big enterprise customer, said the CIO, the chief information officer, called and said, I need to talk to you. And this is a company that had a huge amount. Yeah. So he said, I appreciate you had a hard decision to make. He goes, our infrastructure is running mostly Windows 95. We deployed it in the enterprise. I know you guys don't believe that was the right thing, that we should have deployed Windows NT Workstation in the enterprise, but we deployed Windows 95. He goes, I have gone to my boss and provided an extensive budget to upgrade all computers to Windows 2000. And he begrudgingly agreed to that, and I blamed it on you, right? I blamed it on you. His feedback's fair, right? Sure. He blamed it on me. I made a decision that impacted him. He blamed it on me. He goes, let me tell you why I'm calling. He goes, you're going to get a lot of pressure based on this decision from many people across the world to back down on your commitment, to back off and say, no, to come back in 90 days and say, no, we agreed under pressure that we're going to fix this. We're going to do Y2K fixes for Windows 95. He goes, if you do that, then I'm going to look like a fool and we won't be able to upgrade our infrastructure, which deeply needs to be upgraded. So please, please, you made a commitment, you made it public, stick to it. And I thought, wow, I hadn't really thought about it like that. That was a deeply impactful message to me. Hey, you made a commitment. He, the customer, is making a bunch of decisions based on that commitment.
Yeah.
Interesting, huh?
I really like that because, I mean, I think it goes to our really, really early topic about reputation, right? And I feel like something that drives reputation is trust. And trust is built on people knowing that what you say and what you do line up. And so that's really, really good perspective from the customer. I'm guessing that that's just another one of those actions that sticking with it leads to that
right.
reputation that we talked about ultimately. You said what you were going to do, you're going to stick with it. And the customer called you knowing that, hey, I can call Rich and he's going to stick with this. Maybe my feedback will help it, but I can trust that he's going to do what he said he's going to do. And this customer can stick his reputation on as well.
Let me take that sideways just for a second, because something you said reminded me of something. At the beginning of this call, you asked me about leadership. Leadership with employees is the same thing. You said you were going to do this. You committed to do this. Do it, right? Because you lose credibility as a leader with your team if you say you're going to do something. Like, Jeff, I'm going to work to promote you. If you do the following things, I'm going to promote you. Often what happens is I'm making a commitment to you, Jeff. But then later on, my boss says, well, I haven't seen that from Jeff, or we don't have the budget this time around. And I come back and tell you that, and you're not thrilled, but you give me another 6 months. In 6 months, I come back and I give you the same story. Well, am I a credible leader then? No.
Yeah,
right?
at that point, you're definitely losing it. I mean, you get so many chances, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So in terms of leadership, you called it out. Say what you're going to do and do what you said, right? That is leadership, even if it's painful. You said you were going to do it.
Thank you. I agree. Even if it's painful, I'm kind of sitting with that for a second because you're right. And it might be painful. It might be painful for everyone.
And now I'll bring you back to the beginning of the conversation where I talked about, for me, my priorities: faith, health, family, helping others. Okay. So work isn't on that list other than helping others, right? Family is third after faith and health. If you said you're going to do something for your family and you didn't do it, you prioritize something farther down the list. Why'd you do that? That doesn't seem logical if you know what your priorities are. And I'm not saying my list of faith, health, family, helping others is your list, but you should know what your list is and use that as criteria when you decide to make a decision that's not consistent with what you committed to.
I really like that. I think using it to make decisions is helpful. And then also, I think retroactively looking at it and be like, okay, well, why didn't I do that? Because what you're saying, if someone does this and they look at their kind of list of priorities and then you look at your actions, if those things don't marry up, then what you're really saying is, okay, maybe you need to reevaluate what you actually have on that list or your actions because they really should align. Thanks for following me down that little rabbit hole there.
That's okay.
So we're back. We're deep in Y2K and you were talking about how you're framing the problems and how you have these different problems coming through. You just had the conversation with the unnamed CIO from a large customer. And after you made that decision to stick with it, where'd you go next? What were your next path forward after this?
I said we figure out what our support model was. Okay.
Right, yeah.
So that support model in terms of support life cycle, I can't take credit for that. There's a lot of people involved in many people involved in that, but that stands today as a model for Microsoft. And frankly, it's a model for the industry on how you support products. So we had to figure that out. Then we had to be clear, again, what products we'd fix and what products we didn't fix. Then we had to have CELA involved, legal. That's our legal department at Microsoft. I partnered with a woman named Mary Stapp. Mary Stapp continues to be at Microsoft today after an amazing, I'd say 35 plus years, because there was legal risk in all of this. What a customer lost part of their business? What if there was a disaster associated with a Y2K issue? So we had to clarify what our legal commitment was to customers, and customers, if they wanted to talk to legal, had to have a place to go. I met with many government officials globally on what we were doing and why we were doing it and what they should consider doing. A lot of people in companies and in governments don't have a servicing strategy, sadly, don't have a servicing strategy for their software. the CIO knows, well, we should take the software upgrades that come from Microsoft and other companies. They also learned, and not so much now, but back in those days, that when you upgrade software, you have to retest things because upgrades of software break things. Right. And so people had learned the hard way that maybe I shouldn't take software upgrades. Maybe it's in my best interest to leave the software like it is. And so you have this conflict where we have provided some bad updates. And as a result of that, customers don't necessarily want to take the updates. Right. So you have to go around and evangelize the significance of your software servicing strategy and why it's important for Y2K. So we spent a lot of time doing that. Okay. And then the next thing I had to do is, Chris called me the Y2K czar.
I like that. Yeah, I thought it was pretty funny.
The czar. I don't know
Yeah.
what, I have to look up czar. I mean, I know what it means, but at a deeper level, I have to figure out what that is. Lots of people inside of Microsoft weren't transparent about what they were fixing, weren't clear when they were fixing it. And so then we had to have an internal strategy, and I ran a monthly meeting where every team came up and presented what the status of their products were, what they were fixing, what they weren't fixing. The czar had to negotiate with each of the product teams because some people would say, this product is 4 years and 7/8 months old on January 1st, so we're not going to fix it. And I would say, we have a strategy that says on January 1st, if it's less than 5 years old, I'm sorry, but it has to be fixed. And they would tell me why they can't fix it or why they didn't have access to the code anymore. And then we would work through and ultimately figure out how to make sure that everything got fixed. So we did that. Then we had to talk to the sales force. The customer story I told you about, the customer who told his boss he had to upgrade everything. I certainly didn't want the sales force to use Y2K as a bat or as a reason to tell customers they have to upgrade, because they didn't. If they were running software in the support window, we were going to fix it. But we had to educate the sales force on what Y2K really was and what the ups were and what the downsides were and what the risks were. So we spent a lot of time on internal education. In July of 1999, sales of those years had something called the National Sales Meeting. And so I was responsible to go to the National Sales Meeting and present. I think I am the only person in the history of Microsoft who had a keynote presentation to tens of thousands of people about a bug, right?
Yeah.
I came up and presented about a bug. The team told me, my team was in Building 5 on campus, which is now torn down and the part of the new campus. We were in Building 5, and the team told me, I had on my calendar that we were going to film the segment for that sales meeting. So I think we had to leave at 10, and I figured it was over. There's something people don't know, something called Microsoft Studios, where it's a real production studio. And so I figured we were going to Microsoft Studios. They go, we have to go to Eastern Washington. And I'm like, what? There's no time to go to Eastern. We're not going to Eastern Washington. They go, no, we're filming a really cool video that'll be really funny for the sales meeting. And I'm like, we can't get to Eastern Washington and back in this window of time. They go, no, we rented a helicopter to fly to Eastern Washington. So I'm thinking this is not going to go well. So I go out to the play field. Well, there's soccer fields at Microsoft. At least there used to be at that location. And not only is there a helicopter, there's two helicopters. I said, why are there two helicopters? They go, well, one of them is for us and the other is for the props that we're bringing to film what we're doing. I'm like, oh my God, we're going to get in so much trouble. Anyway, so we flew out to Eastern Washington. What they had built was a bunker door that looked like there was an underground bunker, but all they had was the door that looked like just a common door, but it, had a handle and you could open it up. And so what I did is they put that out in the desert in the middle of nowhere. They dug a hole, not very deep because it's desert. I laid in the hole with a bunker door, and they had music and they basically filmed with a helicopter going around showing me coming out of this door. And what was before was Microsoft was now all desert. So Y2K had happened, and it truly was the end of the world. And in the video, we played a short segment of "It's the end of the world and you know it, and I feel fine." I'm not a very good singer. I shouldn't sing in a podcast. I never should sing in a podcast. I did get in a lot of trouble for allowing the team. I could have given them, to my previous conversation, guidance earlier, but they didn't ask. But don't lease two helicopters and land them on the lawn at Microsoft. The video was very well received. I can show it to you. It's very funny.
I'd love to see it. For a while, I worked when where I would give some new employees as part of an acquisition kind of the rundown on a couple of key points of the policy. And one of the things I would often reference was just, funny things from the policy with the comment that, the thing that I like about this policy is that all policies exist because someone decided to make a decision at some point to do this. And in the policy was a reference to do not rent private chartered aircraft. And so I never knew the story. It turns out that this is probably the reason for that specific item in the policy. Do not rent private aircraft. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So
that's another little legacy there for you.
that's a legacy. Another downside to being the Y2K guy is later on in the 2000s, the US Congress decided to change the day that daylight savings time started. That's hard coded into a bunch of our products to switch to daylight savings time. You would think it'd be a simple change in Windows client and server. It'd be a simple change, and then everyone else would pull from that. But that was not true. So I got deemed as the date. I'm the date
The day guy.
change guy.
Okay.
And so I had to facilitate a second Y2K like thing for daylight savings time. They're like,
You
Kaplan,
handled Y2K, no problem. Just come on, give it to Rich. It's no big deal.
right, Kaplan's the guy to do this. And there's somewhere online, we can probably find it. There's a video of me talking to the press saying, you know what? It's coming in an update automatically. You probably won't even know that it's happening. And in fact, you probably already have it on your PC. And that's what I had said to the press.
Was that accurate? I mean, had it really been taken care of at the moment, or was this a little bit of a PR?
Well, no, it was
shining?
being pushed. It was
Okay.
being pushed at that time. We had their PCs taken it, in a corporate, if they were consumers, they would have it. In a corporate environment, they decide
Oh
when
yeah, that's up to them, sure.
they decide when they push. But that's how I ended up being that guy.
Yeah, I mean, you get a reputation for one thing, and it's just gonna keep on going down the road, I guess. So we talked about how you were approaching the different pieces of the kind of the Y2K puzzle, though, and people were coming back, pushing back. Obviously, they're like they have their own plans for what they want to do with their product, and you had to encourage them to move forward to do that. But so these folks that are coming to you in this meeting, were these all your direct reports, or you just have to influence these folks to get done what you need done?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose if you're asking, how do you do influence without authority?
That's what I was getting at. Yes, sir.
That you were getting to that statement. How did you do influence without authority? You asked, why do people like working for Rich? Why is Rich well received? Because ultimately, I think if you can get people on a common mission that they believe on behalf of not their group, they believe on behalf of customers and the company, that you can work together to solve a problem, right? For the company and for customers. Now, that often doesn't happen. What happens is, Jeff, you're in a group, your group has a set of objectives, and you, um, uh, sorry, the date we're shooting this podcast on, the Blue Angels are in Seattle, and so
That's
they're
pretty
flying
cool.
over my house right now. You can't hear it on the microphone probably, but they just flew over my house at 500
You can
miles an
like
hour.
feel it in your chair. I'm sure those things come. Yeah,
They're
that's cool.
jamming. Anyways, if you get those things right, then people believe in you and want to solve that problem. The place where this falls apart is when people don't believe in the goal or the mission. The good news is, for me on this, it was a big public thing. Everybody knew about it. Bill had committed that we're Y2K compliant. All our stuff is. He overcommitted. That's okay. He's the boss. He can say whatever he wants. And so I had a common mission. I would say, I like to be liked, but if you don't like me, that's okay as a leader. I at least like to be respected. If you don't respect me as a leader, in the end, that's okay too, because I am going to hold you accountable regardless. If we said we're going to do something, we're going to do it. And so hopefully you're in the first two boxes. You like me, you like working with me, we have a common mission, common goal, or hey, maybe you don't, but you just respect that I have to get this done and I committed to it on behalf of the company. And in the end, you know what? I'm just going to make sure you're accountable to do what you said you're going to do, whether you respect me or like me or not. And so I've always operated that way.
Ultimately, that's doing your job. You're accountable to yourself and to the others, and so you got to hold other people accountable. And I like that approach. It goes consistently with what we've been talking about, having being able to articulate the mission and then having clear outcomes and being consistent with that, and then letting people align to it. I think that There's a trend there. I'm definitely seeing.
So all up, that was pretty much the strategy, right? And just constantly for, basically 2.5, 3 years, constantly execute against that, make sure every product we committed to was addressed, make sure the press knew what was going on, calm people down from hysteria in any way, having a clear strategy for the sales force, having the support team ready. One of the jobs I had at Microsoft, I ran support.microsoft.com, and the customer service team at Microsoft reported to me. And on a bad day, we could take 100,000 phone calls from people and have tens of millions of hits on the website. You have to have simple solutions for people on the website. Before anyone ever calls you, they always want to self-serve. The least expensive, easiest way to solve a problem is for you to solve it yourself. Well, if I want you to solve it yourself, then I better make it pretty easy on the website to have a tool to see if I'm Y2K ready. So we produced a tool that you could run on your PC to see if you were Y2K ready. And if you were, then you were all done. That helped people who were fearful, who didn't believe things, who could self-serve, reduced call volume. We gave it to all of our partners, because Dell was taking all the phone calls, right? Gateway at the time, taking phone calls. IBM was taking phone calls. And so I hadn't mentioned before, I should diverge a little bit more sideways. You have all these hardware OEMs who the way hardware agreements are written for our software that they ship. If you buy a PC from IBM and you have trouble with Windows, you have to call IBM. That's how the agreements are written. Same's true for Dell or, any other manufacturer. So we also had to do the work to make sure those hardware partners could articulate the same message, had the same tools, and can help support their customers. So that was another component of our Y2K strategy. And so getting the website right, getting the messaging right on customer service, and having the tools properly done was also key to being successful with this. And then I'd say that was all up. That was the strategy, right? And we just had to keep honing and reiterating and reiterating. And again, common mission, common goals, common objectives, reinforcing that those are the things we're doing. We're not doing things outside of that. And then to your point, getting creative on how you tell that story to people who aren't going to really understand the story.
I mean, it was clearly successful too, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the impact from the problem turned out to be
minimal.
I was going to say nothing, but minimum probably. Not any that I'm aware of. Not anything where I don't know about the power going out anywhere.
The big joke is imagine that you had a project you worked on for 3 years, spent millions of dollars on it, and the outcome, if you did a great job, is nothing happens.
Yeah. Something Chris described was talking about the testing that we did, and kind of going back and forth and trying to test and hope that this patch was there, not knowing if the patches that we were going to put out were going to solve the problems because there's a lot of information barriers there that we couldn't pierce. Like, what was your confidence level going in to New Year's Eve on 1999?
I'm gonna turn that into a two-part question.
Please.
I was confident in the book of work that Microsoft did, our collective teams did to solve the problem. I was thinking through the other day, who are who are all the people that worked on this, right? And there's people on my team like Don Jones, Mark Light, Cal Allaby, Jason Matisow. I told you Mary Snap, M3 Sweat worked on this problem. Chris Walker, who did a podcast with you, the previous one. Wendy Ekman, Gene Sheldon in Office had to fix a bunch of issues, right? And ran her own thing there. Paolo Salvatore, Nancy Klutz, Eric Hansen. That's just a short list of people who I could think about who wrote articles and did things like that. So my confidence level based on all those amazing, amazing people was high that what we did would fix the problems. Now, this is why I'm making it two parts. I don't know how people were using our software. Really have no idea, right? And Chris brought this up. Our legal agreement says you can't use software to do the following things. And people do it anyway. We talked about me having chemotherapy. What if the machine that delivered chemotherapy was date-based and it said, deliver this amount of chemo every hour, and you were having chemo at 11:55 on December 31st, 1999, and they were using a 2-digit date, in their software, and it rolled over the next hour, and it did a calculation from a 2-digit date. And the way this works, since it was 2000, it only used 2 digits. It showed the new date as 00, and it asked if it calculated the previous date the year was 99. And so what happened is their buffer was not set up for a negative number. It came up with negative 99. How could that be possible? And the machine failed, and I didn't get the chemo delivered, or got too much delivered because the procedure failed. So I'll repeat, I had confidence in the book of work that we did. That book of work had to be handed to other people. In that case, a manufacturer of a chemo machine who then had to fix it. And that manufacturer had a chemo machine at Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center who had to make sure all their machines were updated. So there's this sort of 1, 2, 3. Everybody has to do their job to make sure that it worked correctly. And so I'd say I had high confidence because there was so much press about the importance of this. Now, I'll tell you, we had thousands of people sitting in support centers globally on December 31st, 1999. As you know, our support model is a follow the sun model, meaning the sun comes up in New Zealand and Australia first thing. We have a support center that services them out of Singapore. So we knew basically 23 hours before Y2K in the US, New Zealand and Australia basically had something close to 0 calls, right? And then as it rolled around Southeast Asia and then into Europe, 5 hours in, we knew we were good. But the call volumes were low, that we could send people home, that it wasn't going to be a big deal. We overstaffed, rightfully so, but in the end, we were in good shape.
I appreciate you breaking it into 2 parts. As the outsider here, I'm realizing there's effectively an infinite number of permutations that could have happened with all of those scenarios you just described. And it's really impossible to plan for and understand how people could be using the software at any given point in time. And so you did your best and solved for the majority of those problems. But that's just adds to, in my mind, the complexity of what you were working through and the importance of sharing the information out in a bunch of different ways so that everyone could understand it and helping to remove fear and just making sure that people could work through and do some of the problem solving themselves.
And it applies today. You always hear about hacks and security patches. There was one yesterday regarding the cloud. And the question is, who is patching your systems? If you're a big enterprise customer, you might have a contract with a partner. That partner may or may not have good experiences with patches. Their policy might be wait 120 days to patch any systems after Microsoft releases it. So that will allow others to test this within 120 days. If we feel confident based on our own internal testing and what others have seen, then we'll patch. Okay, that is a strategy. But if you get hacked in that window, right? Whose fault is that? Is that Microsoft's issue? Right? Is that the partner's issue? Is that the customer's issue? And so those strategies still apply today.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I was going to say one of the upsides of the cloud, however, is running Office 365 or any cloud services from Microsoft is Microsoft's accountable for patching, right? In real time. There's only one finger to point at, all right, who's accountable to do it. That's the benefit of having Microsoft run those services is they're 100% accountable.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And
I would say it was a defining moment in my career. I learned a lot. It helped set some company strategies in place that, like I said, still apply today. You asked about influence without authority. I certainly believe I learned that at scale, and people recognize me for that. And so I'd say it was just a very interesting point in time. And, happenstance that Steve Ballmer, the executive vice president of sales, called me out in a meeting because I was being a little condescending. And he said I was accountable. And hey, that's a learning for me. That's a learning for anyone listening to this podcast. Be careful what you complain about.
Also, the benefit of like a hard problem, but you were being your authentic self, you showed up.
Yeah.
You didn't couch yourself. You knew that there was a legitimate concern and you raised it. And
yeah.
Mr. Ballmer knew how to handle that situation, it sounds like.
I had to present a bunch of Windows data. This is regarding Windows security in a meeting with Steve. And as a part of that, I had to show OEM PC sales and retail PC sales, and then do calculations on what we thought the market opportunity was for a security product based on those sales. And I did a bunch of calculations, and this is maybe a mistake, and showed a spreadsheet to Steve in a meeting. And my conclusion was based on the data in the spreadsheet. So one of the things about Steve, a brilliant, brilliant man, deep expert in math and calculations. I'm presenting to get guidance. I'm not asking for approval. And Steve said, you need to stop. And he points up to the spreadsheet, and he goes, let's see if I can get that on the camera. He goes, that number is wrong, right? This is like a 20 by 30 spreadsheet. And he's pointing to one cell in the middle, E27. He said, that number's wrong. And I'm like, no, I said, these numbers are right. He goes, no, I know the OEM PC sales numbers, and that number's wrong. Steve is very good at finding patterns in data. He's a brilliant, brilliant man and deeply understands data. But the rest of my presentation was done because it was based on data that was wrong. And should he have pointed that out? Yes, absolutely. Did it feel very good that I made a mistake in a meeting and I showed it to the CEO of the company? No, that was foolish. What did I learn? I learned don't show up for a meeting with the CEO of the company where the data is not inspected 100 times first to make sure it's accurate. And I didn't have the right people inspect it. There were lots of those. I would also say, let me transition away from Steve, who I love, by the way. There's lots of people in the early days that were bullies, right? And they were going to get their way. And in some senses, you need that in a startup in early years of a company, because there are key people, key brilliant people who push and drive to build market share, to get it to things launched before others. And to win, you have to have those people. And so that was common. The problem is when you put those people in positions of leadership and ask them to manage people, because those aren't necessarily the people you want to lead other people. Like lots of small startups, we didn't really know that or understand that. I think Microsoft does now. You want leaders who have empathy and compassion to lead big teams. Sometimes you need the person who's driving the strategy, who has the vision and breakthrough, to be the person who does that, but doesn't lead the team. And so that's also a good way to think about doing this.
When do you think that culture changed or started to change?
I don't think it started to change until Satya, so 11 years ago.
I could see that. I mean, it felt like there was a big change.
I think it's a constant challenge, right? You want the brilliant person who has the vision of the future to be able to influence with authority. But if that authority doesn't come with empathy and compassion, then it's difficult. And that's the reason I lead the way I lead. But I'm probably not the guy. I don't think I ever was the guy to come up with a new technology vision for a product or a company. I managed marketing in Windows. Maybe that was a big deal. Am I the breakthrough innovator? No, it's a balance thing. My wife would probably say you're being too humble, but
Thank goodness for good spouses, right? I wasn't around at Microsoft at that time, but in a way, I think that's a form of innovation of its own. I mean, to your point, early days Microsoft, there's a lot of a different culture, and being able to lead in the way that you did, I think that's a type of innovation. Maybe it wasn't directly related to a breakthrough on a new product, but changing the culture, I think, leading in a different way is a facilitator for those things. And I would call it a kind of innovation. To hear the stories I've heard about early days of Microsoft, which are really tremendous and really exciting in a lot of ways. But from a culture perspective, my experience was vastly different, and happened because folks paved the way.
I work for some brilliant managers and brilliant managers of managers, who I learned a lot of things from. I learned to be tough. I learned to not take things personally. We also talked before that you have different types of people on your team. Introverts, who it's hard to get their feedback from. People with attention deficit disorder, who what you say to them is maybe more impactful. You have people who've been in abusive relationships over time. And so if they have those issues, you don't know their life experience. If they go to work and suddenly you have leaders who are bullies, those people don't develop tough skins. Those people do take things personally. And then you have employee problems. You have to recognize the importance of modeling the behavior that you expect. You really have to do that, because if the leaders aren't showing up doing that, then the employees don't show up doing that, and then you have problems.
Who were your major examples? I mean, you mentioned a couple leaders. Anything standing out? I mean, you're a great leader yourself and extremely influential. Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, pretty impressive folks. Kind of what their influence was on you and how your interactions with them shaped you as a person.
Well, you know what? In the very early days, I shouldn't say very early days because I wasn't here in the early days. I joined 15 years after the company started. I joined in 1990. When I joined, there was about globally, the company was about 5,000 employees. I know the company has over 200,000 or something today, but 5,000 employees. In the Pacific Northwest here, there was probably 2,000 employees. We were in 6 buildings. No, with the data center was a building 11. So we were in 11 buildings. You sort of knew everybody, not by name, but most people. We were trying to convince the world that you needed a PC, right? You know, the mission of the company back then was a PC on every desk and in every home. That was the mission. Well, 35 years later, guess what? We're absolutely there. Was that a big mission? It was at the time. I remember my mother saying, why would I ever want a PC? Why would I ever want a PC? Okay. And so they pushed really hard. They signed incredibly difficult agreements with vendors. They spent time in Washington, D.C., convincing people why it was important. We ended up in D.C. with judgment against us, the consent decree, right? That said we would do things and we wouldn't do things. And that we don't want to jump into it other than to say we were being aggressive, right? We're being aggressive to achieve our mission. And so I did learn from them. You said it before. If you're committed to do something, then do it, right? If you're committed to do something, do it. And we also talked about things being difficult. Despite it's difficult, that doesn't mean don't do it. You committed to do it. And so I learned those things from them. I shared the Steve story about a spreadsheet where I presented a wrong number. Be relentless in your pursuit of the truth in terms of data. Data should drive everything. You can't casually look at data and say it looks good. If you put a spreadsheet on a table with 27 columns by 8 columns, I can't remember what it said, know every cell, know the source of the data, because they probably do. I learned pick good people. If you don't pick good people, I talked about different kinds of people. Pick great people. Pick people who have integrity. Pick people who know things are hard. Pick people who are passionate about things. Any startup has to have those passionate people who drive change. And that's, I'd say, primarily what I learned from both of them.
Those are really great examples. And clearly they had the right attributes in all those things, to not be afraid of the hard things, to really, really drive hard for the truth, and then to pick good people. Steve Ballmer picked the right person to lead Y2K because, like we said, the power stayed on. So
Power stayed on. Jeff Rakes was the EVP of Office, the Executive Vice President of Office for many years. And then he became the CEO of the Gates Foundation, whose general purpose was to help things be better in the world, to wipe out diseases, to give vaccines across Africa, to teach people to grow food, use technology to help them. An amazing man. Steve Ballmer picked Jeff. Jeff worked for Steve Jobs at Apple. Jeff was coming up to Seattle to see his sister. He had happened to talk to Steve Ballmer, and Steve Ballmer said, well, we'll fly you up here. So he thought to himself, I talked to him about this. He goes, well, I'll get a free flight, so that's good. And they'll probably feed me. So he gets up here and Steve basically offers him a job on the office team. I can't remember now if it was exactly the office team at the time. Jeff asked him, what about stock options, right? And Steve didn't really have the answer for that because there wasn't really a stock option policy at the time. So Jeff asking that question basically ended up driving the stock option strategy in the early 80s for employees in the company, right? And again, it's one of those things. Someone asked a question. He said, listen, I'll join if I get the following, right? And that turned into a policy and a strategy. And so he's another just insanely brilliant man. Every time I talk to him, I learn something. That, again, pick the right people, right? Pick people who are in the details, in the data. You do that, you solve problems. And my goal always has been to, I said in the beginning, is to help others to be successful. Y2K in particular, I think helps a lot of people be successful.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I love that. That's a great analogy and an example with the picking good people. You think about the trickle down effect from what's happened with that one person, Jeff Rakes, being hired and then career at Microsoft and then ultimately running the Gates Foundation and the impact that that's had across the world. I mean, that's just
Stunning.
tremendous. Yeah.
Right. Talk about helping other people. It's stunning.
Yeah.
Right.
Coming down to
And
picking the people. Yeah.
picking the people. He picked the right guy.
That's really neat. I really, really enjoyed this. This has just been tremendous. Thanks for jumping on and
Sure.
spending all this time with me. Can't say enough. This is really great.
Welcome to the 4F, 4Fs with Jeff.